Sorry. Sorry for the delay in technology. We are now rolling. This is a session on Southern infrastructure with an update coming from Ross Copeland, who's coming out from Queenstown to speak with us. Here you will touch base on or provide information on the proposed Queenstown cable car project. But before he speaks, Rich will just set the context a little bit for where this fits into the PT.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So, as you'll be aware, we tried to fit the session in a couple of times towards the end of 2025 and just couldn't get calendars to work. So, we finally managed to line it up, and thankful for Ross coming over from Queenstown in person. The cable car is a project that has been proposed, and Ross will talk a little bit about the group proposing it, but it sits within the broader regional deal conversation. And obviously there is negotiations going on at the moment, and a key part or topic within that regional deal is transport. So it's and ORC has a specific interest in that as the public transport provider within Queenstown. So there are still conversations happening. There's some work that Anita and the team are overseeing in terms of network plans and what a good future transport solution, a holistic solution within Queenstown would look like, which might include mass rapid transport, which would be a cable car or similar, buses, ferries, and obviously Queenstown and NZTA both with us interest in terms of the road network and state highway network as well. So it's part of the broader transport solution for Queenstown. But a significant amount of work has gone in from Ross and his team, and also supported by both QLDC and ORC's transport planning team to best understand how all of these things might work together to deliver that transport solution. So in terms of today's workshop, the first part of it is a public workshop. Most of the information you'll hear from Ross is public already. There's been various presentations and media releases. We also understand there might be some questions that are more commercial in terms of the relationship of this project with ORC's public transport delivery. So what we're going to do is run it as a public workshop, deal with whatever questions Ross is comfortable to deal with. And then at a point in time where there might be some more commercial questions that councils have an interest in, we will go into non-public and we'll make that call at the appropriate time, and that will allow a more of a conversation into that area around the commercial side of it. So that will answer Kate's question that I just saw pop up online, and I'll hand over to Ross to get into it.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thank you, councillors, for making the time on the agenda. I imagine you have many people wanting to present, lots of good topics to talk about. So really appreciate the opportunity to get together today to share a little bit about this project and what we think is a pretty practical solution to some of the challenges we're facing in Queenstown currently. Let me just make sure I've got the right prezzo coming up. Is that one coming up on your screens? There we go. There we go, full screen. I'll just shrink this side here so we can keep it going. Cool. So just perhaps always good to start with the problem we're trying to solve. So Queenstown, as you well know, is growing pretty rapidly. I think the compound annual growth rate and population sits at around 5% for about 3 decades now. Since COVID, we've had a massive increase in both tourism numbers and resident population. And more recently, we've seen some pretty strong activity around rezoning or increasing the density of existing zones, which have given rise to unplanned growth that's significantly beyond even what the spatial plan and the current Queenstown Lakes District Council existing residential and urban growth areas have foreseen or allowed for. And basically, the way that's manifesting is pretty massive traffic demand growing on very constrained networks. And we're seeing this collision of increasing demand, restricting and making it very difficult to build upgrades to that network because it's a live traffic or transport environment. How that manifests for the regional council and your role as a regional public transport authority is you're getting less and less per unit of capital and OPEX you invest as your equipment gets stuck in longer and longer delays and slower trip times. So I'm a civil engineer by background, really enjoy the maths, and some pretty basic maths that I think we can all understand is if you've got a fixed fleet of a fixed capacity and the average travel time of that vehicle increases by a factor of 2, it doubles, then the capacity or the number of seats per hour that you're able to deliver to move people around the Queenstown Lakes District, or any network for that matter, effectively halves. So you face a difficult challenge of either doubling the investment in that fleet to maintain the capacity at its current level, or if you're trying to match the growth, having to increase that not only by double to match the halving in the overall capacity, but also to match that underlying growth rate. And these are non-linear relationships. So as traffic demand grows, there is not a linear relationship between trip speed or overall sort of commute time. That starts to go exponential when the road reaches capacity. So if we take a sort of an example that's well understood, Frankton Road between Queenstown Airport and the town centre, that road has turned the corner. So in 2019, there were 140 days a year where Frankton Road exceeded its design capacity. That's been well canvassed by the Transport Agency and others across a series of business cases. Now today, since 2019, we've experienced on Frankton Road between 6 and 7% compound annual growth in transport volumes. And that's given rise to an increase in those number of days to north of 200. So essentially every single weekday, that road is now exceeding its design capacity. And even on some weekend days it is as well, because of tourism movements on weekend days. So in a transport capacity sense, that basically means you've got a whole lot of stationary fleet costing you a fortune, because as we all well know, bus networks are largely fixed cost assets. Once you commit to operating that service, the variable cost component of that is relatively small. It's a big fixed cost network. So this sort of general challenge of Queenstown, which has got insecurity on almost every road, and what that means is there's no alternatives. So it's very difficult to route traffic a different way while you perform an upgrade on the network. And it is growing at a sustained rate of around 6% per annum on Frankton Road, and currently around 12% per annum at Kawerau Falls Bridge. Slightly over, I think for the last 12 months it was a bit over 12%. On the main road that runs, or State Highway 6 that runs past the 5 Mile or Queenstown Central Shopping Centre, that one's compounding at a bit over 10% per annum. And if you want to think of this in a really simple way, people often think, 2-3%, annual growth doesn't sound like that much. A very simple way of thinking about this, I had a maths lecturer that basically said, great way to think about it is to think about the time it takes to double with steady growth. So if you take the number 70 and you divide it by the rate of annual growth, you'll get the time to double. So at 10% per annum, which is what we're seeing increasing along State Highway 6 outside the 5 Mile Shopping Centre, that traffic is doubling every 7 years. And if you think, well, what would it look like to double the capacity of that network every 7 years? It's a wholly unrealistic proposition when you start to look at the land use around it, the cost of land, demolishing housing to make way for roading, etc. So it starts to become quite a difficult problem to solve using conventional or road-based transport solutions. And the best we can likely hope for is through a combination of demand management tools and increasing penetration or mode shift to public transport to tread water is probably about as good as we can hope for, given the massive increase in underlying transport demand. So it begs the question really for Queenstown is, does Queenstown stop growing, or do we have to look at options to develop offline transport capacity that can deliver to that unmet demand or unmet need? And the Queenstown Cable Car quite openly is a proposal to start to decouple underlying population or visitor growth from traffic growth. That's the essence of what the project's all about. Quickly about Southern Infrastructure, we're a small team that was really founded out of a desire to accelerate some of these projects that are public infrastructure that for one reason or another hasn't been progressed by the public sector. So the two key projects that we're leading at the moment are a regional hospital project for the Otago Central Lakes region, working with a whole group of people on firstly working to convince the government that there's an unmet need, And the government, as we understand, are convinced of that now and have produced the clinical services plan for the region, which identifies a series of potential pathways to provide for that unmet need. And secondly, the Queenstown Cable Car. Rod Drury is someone who is pretty well known to most of us, but we're very fortunate and privileged to have him based in Queenstown, where he's willing to put up this kind of risk capital, which has helped fund the progress of this project to date. And Jenna Adamson is another director with a strong background in legal and property, who together we lead the team. We've got a large team of consultants and experts that provide support to us to help us get to where we've got to so far. The sort of general ethos is for us about, I guess, using, as much as we're trying to solve some of these challenges in Queenstown, we're trying to use Queenstown as a bit of a test lab for how to do things differently in this infrastructure delivery space. Queenstown's quite unique in New Zealand, with one of the highest growth rates in the whole country. Policy tools and delivery options tested in Queenstown can give you a sense of 5 or 6 years of growth in a normal city. And that's very helpful for policymakers to start thinking about what might work in other towns and cities that are experiencing growth around New Zealand. And it's unashamedly our strategy to try and influence policy in the infrastructure delivery space. New Zealand has historically achieved among the lowest 10% of developed countries globally for the amount of infrastructure we get for every unit of capital we invest. My former role as the Chief Executive at the Infrastructure Commission, and we did a lot of studies looking at why New Zealand's productivity rates are so low and why we achieve such poor value for money. So this is a big focus for us alongside delivering these projects. So I've sort of talked about this in my introductory comments, but the sort of theme is it's not just transport. Every network in Queenstown has more or less reached capacity. That's happened concurrently. And that's a manifestation of a couple of different factors. But one of those predominant factors that we've seen consistently is the under-forecasting of growth by Stats New Zealand, and then that cascading into the growth assumptions that our councils make around their own infrastructure upgrade plans and pathways. That corresponds into underinvestment in things like long-term plans. And that means we always seem to be catching up or chasing growth. We never seem to get ahead of it. And we're experiencing higher and higher costs to execute catch-up investments because they're operating in live networks and live environments. And the current work that the New Zealand Upgrade Program are delivering is a very good case in point, where it's slow, it's costly, and it's quite disruptive as a function of having to operate in that live environment. There's a number of other factors that are interesting about Queenstown and the entire Central Lakes region. One of those is how that shifting population mass over time is likely to mean that the Otago Central Lakes region is the second largest population centre in the South Island in the late 2030s to early 2040s. And that's not our analysis, that's work that's been done by a number of people, including economist Benji Patterson, who's really looked at this growth story and helped Queenstown understand, and the Central Otago region more broadly, what does it look like when you grow up from town-sized infrastructure to city-sized infrastructure, and what is the pathway that's the least disruptive, most efficient way to get from where we are today to where we're likely to need to be, so that we're not constantly playing catch up. We're doing these really expensive upgrades in existing networks. This density issue is one that is both a challenge and a blessing. So for projects like the Queenstown Cable Car, they simply don't stack up without the density around the key stations or transport hubs. So you need to get to a sort of a threshold density level before this kind of investment is even remotely plausible. Queenstown is starting to approach the types of density that warrant the step change from bus type networks as your primary mode of transport, public transport, to a mass rapid transit offline type solution. It's very unlikely that Queenstown in the next sort of 3 or 4 decades would get to a density level that would warrant an investment in something as high capacity as rail. Bus rapid transit possibly, if you had the capacity and the cost, the available capital to deliver it. So we've got this huge amount of density coming, but not enough to warrant that more traditional delivery model with likes of rail or bus rapid transit. And cable car fills quite a nice gap in that network where the capacities are substantially higher than what you can achieve on a single lane or single carriageway road, but they're not, in terms of cost per kilometre, they're nowhere near the cost or the capacity that you might get with a commuter rail network like you see in Auckland City or Wellington City. So with this increase in density, yes, it will bring traffic and transport demand, but it also provides the opportunity to think about solutions like the cable car. In terms of the options, this is what I'm starting to touch on, but the cost of something like an elevated light rail solution or a tunneled light rail solution would be in the order of $1 billion a kilometre, based on recent examples that have been studied here and abroad. Sydney Light Rail completed about 5 or 6 years ago now, I think was about 260 million Australian dollars per kilometre. Just to give a sense, that was at grade. We don't have the land for that, unfortunately, when you look at some of our network constraints with the geographical constraints in particular. So our geology, Frankton Road, as you might recall, in the 2009 flood events, had a massive slip come down and block the road and knocked over a number of homes on the lakefront. So there's a range of both geological rivers, lakes and mountains, high value property, and just a very narrow transport corridor. That means we really are looking at solutions that either go over, under or through. It's very difficult to go alongside the existing transport networks with upgrades. So just jumping to the solution itself, and I might add that this is not the sort of core intent or the design philosophy here is not the work of Southern Infrastructure. This is work that's been done over well over a decade now, looking at offline transport solutions through, I think we're up to 9 or 10 different business cases that have studied this. And the options are basically self-selecting because of that criteria that I mentioned previously. So the technical criteria includes things like operating within the constraints of the Queenstown Airport. So at both ends of each of the 2 runways, there's a crosswind runway and the main runway. There are setback requirements, there are maximum height limits that dictate how tall a cable car could be or where it could be located. So we've worked around that. Likewise, we've got the high voltage transmission lines that feed from the Cromwell substation through to Queenstown at the Frankton GXP. Those power lines have particular constraints as well around going over, under or next to. The State Highway 6 that runs through Queenstown is an over-dimensioned transport route. So it is used by heavy haulage firms to move things like transformers for the Manapori Power Station, potentially houses that are moving inland through Otago. And it's largely because there are no low overbridges on that part of the network. So it is actually one of the least constrained parts of the network, despite things like the Devil's Staircase, which sort of intuitively it wouldn't be your preferred option. But those are all, I'm just trying to give a sense of, those are the types of things that have meant this design, doesn't matter who does it, whether it's me or any other engineer, largely selects itself. So I want you to sort of understand that there is some degree of flexibility around individual station locations and some degree of choice around that, but there's not a whole lot. In the center of the map here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse on the screen as an example, but this is that huge slip that came down in the 2009 floods. So there's geological constraints, there's a whole lot of different factors here. And quite frankly, there's what we might call the consentability constraint, which is this project has to be able to be consented in a normal course of events without disrupting property rights for the thousands of people who have bought homes and expensive real estate along Frankton Road. So it isn't designed as a network to service every type of transport requirement. It's designed quite intentionally as mass rapid transit. It will be the first mass rapid transit project in the South Island. There is none anywhere in the South Island today. Christchurch City is looking at a number of different MRT options, and Queenstown with the offline transport studies are looking at some options, including this cable car proposal. So we have to think about it in the context of how MRT is different from bus. You can think about bus in a conventional sense as a distribution service with some point-to-point services as well. This cable car network or mass rapid transit is all about moving high volumes of people between the big transport nodes without lots of stops. It's point-to-point transport. In an electricity sense, you can kind of think of this as the transmission line as opposed to the distribution line that the bus service delivers. So they are very different cases. They are for very different purposes, but they are entirely codependent. Both require the other to perform in a network that's doubling at the rate we're seeing. So it's just a common question that comes up is, how is this different or complementary? And how will I get to my hotel on Frankton Road, for example? The answer is you will still use road-based transport. This is for the 3/4 of people who travel down Frankton Road who don't have a destination on Frankton Road. They're attempting to get from one end to the other, from the CBD to the airport or beyond. The second, the key point about this diagram before we move off it is it really highlights or connects the planned urban growth areas for Queenstown, but does that in a staged approach. So a lot of these mass rapid transit projects, including Auckland Light Rail as one example, have really struggled by trying to do too much too soon. What we've seen in cities like Canberra, Sydney, a lot of places around Australia that are analogous to the kind of growth challenge we're dealing with, is that the successful projects have built sequenced stages and learned and grown from that success as they've gone on, rather than trying to do the big bang, build it all at once type of model, which has proven to kill a lot of good projects quite early in the process. So the green line is the part of the network that is currently the most constrained. That's State Highway 6A from Queenstown Airport into the town centre. It is, as I mentioned before, it is over its design capacity on about 200 days a year, essentially every single weekday of the year during those rush hour movements. And so the green line is an obvious one to do first because it meets that existing transport demand. You're not trying to create or induce demand to justify this investment. The red line that runs out to Ladies Mile is our stage 2, and it could be delivered concurrently or it could be delivered secondly, because it services quite a different need. It's really about enabling urban growth through the Ladies Mile plan change. There's an additional several thousand homes proposed to be developed, a number of schools, a retail precinct and so on Ladies Mile. And it also connects to Frankton North, which is a large area of land that already has been upzoned significantly through the Queenstown proposed district plan quite a few years ago now. And the development is just kicking off along there. So those are the two parts of the network we propose to do first, but we have future-proofed the design with stations at key locations that allow expansion into Arthur's Point and into the Southern Corridor. So I'll sort of move on from this one, but I'd be more than happy to come back to questions about network design as we go through the discussion. Basic sort of maths on this is the current average speeds at peak along Frankton Road are about 20 kilometres per hour. The cable car moves at 25. So just to give you a sense of speed, the trip times between the airport and the CBD are already faster than rush hour commute times by vehicle or by public transport, and are likely to continue to perform considerably better as that network gets busier and busier and those trip times increase. It has pretty high capacity, so 3,000 people per hour in each direction, obviously reducing where there's luggage in the cabins or where there's bikes and so on. But if it's just commuter traffic at those peak hours of the day, those are reliable seated capacity figures. So 3,000 per hour means every single person has a seat. That's not based on sort of crush capacities that you might see with other modes of transport. It's very high frequency. So one of the benefits to integrating a cable car with conventional public transport is that the cabin frequencies are or the headways are so short at only 12-second intervals that you really don't require timetables for the cable car. So if the bus runs 3 or 4 minutes late, you don't miss the interchanging bus and you don't get that cascading effect of timetable degradation through the day. So it's a very, very helpful network to interface, particularly in a situation like Queenstown has, where we're finding it increasingly more difficult to achieve reliable trip times in our core bus timetables because of congestion on the road. So very, very helpful for that. The cabins are pretty big, so they're designed to turn a wheelchair inside, so full accessibility. You can basically drive a quad bike inside of one of these things. They're so big. So they're similar in volume to a HiAce minivan, if you like, one every 12 seconds. And what we've seen post-COVID is there is a preference to travel in family groups. That seems to be an increasing preference. So a smaller vehicle that moves frequently with high capacity suits the way people like to travel. And we think that the cable car mode, based on what we're seeing internationally, will have very strong uptake and a very strong preference over large vehicles, sort of articulated buses with 100+ seats are a less pleasant environment, particularly when a lot of that capacity is standing capacity. Consistent trip times are a key factor for Queenstown. We do get snow and ice loadings, and obviously using the gondola technology that's been adapted from the alpine environment, these things are very resilient to weather and very low disruption due to snow, ice and similar conditions. They're also very seismically resilient. So in a place like Queenstown, which has a high earthquake risk, a network that can operate reliably post-earthquake is a very helpful thing. And the nature and the design with the ductility of the structure and the cables means that these are very resilient to earthquakes or can be repaired very quickly if there's damage to one tower, for example, in an earthquake scenario. So we think it's a technology that suits Queenstown. Just to give you a sense of who we're working with as Southern Infrastructure. So in order to progress and finalise our detailed discussions with landowners, we had to work through a process of selecting a preferred supplier for each of the 2 lines so that we could finalise the design and then say to landowners, this is exactly what we would propose to do on your land. So the tower placements, the tower heights, the colours, etc., the hours of operation, the noise, all of those different questions that landowners had, they're all very fair questions, and we needed to progress our procurement activities so that we could answer them. The benefit, I guess, of doing that is now we have hard tender prices for each of the 2 sections as well. So that's very helpful to feed into our business case process. The main variability around that cost now is foreign exchange, or the New Zealand dollar versus the euro, when we go to actually finally sign and execute that contract. But we have contract prices bid through a competitive tender process. We engaged Resolve Group, who is a national infrastructure procurement firm, as our client's project manager, and they ran a procurement process in a fully transparent way as if we were running a public transport tender, so that we could give the confidence to the ultimate funders of the project that we've done that in a very robust way. And these 2 companies, I guess, just to give you a sense, these are the sort of Boeing and Airbus of the ropeways industry. So north of €1 billion turnover each. These companies are installing 50 to 100 ropeway installations annually. They're rolling out huge mass rapid transit networks across Latin America in particular, but also in Western cities now. So Doppelmayr opened the C1 cable car in Paris a few months ago. We took Richard to visit when we were on a study tour, meeting with the different suppliers and discuss with the procuring agency, the Metropolitan Authority of France, or Paris City, who was responsible for executing that project, talked about the speed of execution, the competence and the capability of their delivery partners, on time, on budget performance of the project, and I guess the flexibility that allowed that asset to be delivered where traditional transport solutions couldn't have. The data coming out of Paris is very interesting. So patronage, even a couple of months in, is already exceeding their forecasts. So it has been very well received by the public. Just to close out the procurement process, so we've finalised the procurement for the 2 ropeway companies and the buildings contract, which is the other large part of the contract. We're currently in procurement on, so we've got 3 suppliers that we're working through a bid process on at the moment. That will allow us to get the last sort of 20 to 30% of the budget locked in and have very little discretion around the ultimate build cost of the 2 parts of the network. So funding and financing, this is always the fun question, is who pays, how do we pay? So there's really 2 quite distinct business cases for the 2 first lines. Airport to town centre, as I mentioned, is an existing transport demand that isn't met. So there's a very compelling case to deliver quite a conventional public transport investment in that part of the network. On the Franklin to Ladies Mile line, that's a network that, yes, has some existing demand. Obviously there's a significant residential population at that end of the network already, but really what that network is about is servicing future growth. So a lot of the benefits from building this infrastructure will accrue to landowners that have bought land on Ladies Mile, and it's necessarily fair and equitable that those landowners would make a contribution to the capital costs of the project, which they will ultimately benefit from, and the development will be unlocked by. So there's 2 slightly different models for the 2 parts of the network that we think balance this need for funding and financing equity, and balance this, I guess, underlying objective when we're thinking about how do you fund the infrastructure, which is this beneficiaries pays principle. So in New Zealand, Public Finance Act, standard conventions for thinking about who should pay for infrastructure. If you exacerbate demand, or if you benefit either through land revaluation or a faster drive time, you should make some contribution. And the way we've thought about the model, the financial model, is deliberately focused on addressing or redressing the imbalance that's evolved, where ratepayers are effectively subsidising infrastructure for visitors to Queenstown. I think now for every visitor to Queenstown, for every ratepayer, there's something like 34 visitors to Queenstown. So we've got this 40,000 population trying to fund and finance infrastructure for 3 million plus annual visitors. And that model isn't scalable and it isn't equitable. So we've been very deliberate in our modelling to think about that. In the financing, so as distinct from the funding, which is the revenue side, the financing with Southern Infrastructure and Rod Drury as our key financial backer are taking the risk, if you like, at this very extreme end of the project, which is the consenting, the design, the procurement, the negotiations with the Transport Agency. And obviously we're excited about a discussion with ORC on the revenue model as well. This is a very, very risky part of any project, and it's a part that for many reasons, typically is one reason why a lot of these projects don't progress beyond the business case stage. So the proposal was basically that we would finance the project through to a point where we've de-risked the investment, and then we would love to see this project transition into some mixed ownership or public ownership in the fullness of time. But we are fully comfortable and appreciate that there are certain thresholds around risk that the public tend to prefer are resolved before their investment is made. And that tends to include not taking on delivery risk or execution risk. So our goal is to basically raise construction capital, take the project through to constructed and operational, have it commissioned and operating, and foresee right from the very outset that there would be an opportunity to bring the project into some mixed or public ownership at that point in time. Probably the final thing just to say on this funding and financing before we get into a more detailed conversation is there is a real challenge around some of the policy tools that New Zealand has put in place deliberately for types of projects like this. The International Visitor Levy is a case in point where I was a huge advocate of the levy and increasing the levy to a more sustainable level. For those who don't know, the policy intent of the infrastructure or the International Visitor Levy is it is explicitly intended to allocate a portion of that levy to addressing the infrastructure demand that visitors put on places like Queenstown, the Mackenzie Basin, the West Coast District, parts of the North Island, around Hobbiton and places like that have a disproportionate mix of visitors to ratepayers, and the conventions of the Local Government Act and other conventional infrastructure financing and funding tools don't work particularly well in that context. That's what it was intended for, and unfortunately we haven't seen that play out in the execution of that policy. So we're not putting a huge amount of stock in achieving a contribution from the International Visitor Levy, despite the fact that on the face of it, I don't think you could get a project that was more specifically designed for that policy tool than the Queenstown Cable Car. So that's forced us, just to give you a sense of how we've thought about it, the sort of lukewarm response to IVL funding through the regional deal and other processes has pushed us back to thinking about some other mechanisms. And the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act is a tool that we think lends itself really nicely to complementing core public transport and other revenues so that we're not shifting that burden onto ratepayers. Key milestones. So we've managed to get a fair bit done in about 18 months that we've been really running after this. We're well down the track with the procurement, the resource consent, and some of these funding conversations. The next steps to get our resource consent approved by the end of this calendar year, and to get to a final investment decision to proceed with stage one towards Q4 of this year or the first quarter of next year is our goal. We are entirely aware that that means the public sector, regional council included, will have to move at a pace that is outside of its norm. And it might mean that we have to run some type of collaborative model to insert projects into formal processes outside of the normal course of events. But our view is that the transport demand is acute. For those who live in Queenstown, I think you'll sympathise with that point of view, that there is an acute existing need, and the deferral of investment from the New Zealand Upgrade Program really means this project is on the urgent list now. So we don't particularly apologise for this program. It is tough. It will be tough for everyone to achieve, but it's an aspirational program that we think is necessary. That was what I wanted to share, Rich, in the public session. But I'm super happy to take questions about the sort of scope and those factors, and then we can perhaps get into a conversation more about the commercials.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's great to have a full rundown on everything and the fine work that's gone in. And I think that as a Queenstown resident, I'm fully aware of the challenges that go on personally and for businesses and people moving around the district. And I think that it's fantastic having people with the generosity that Rod has shown financially to be able to put this sort of stuff in front of the community, and then have people with interest and brains like yourself to be able to communicate and deliver on what the opportunities are. So yeah, thank you very much for that work on behalf of the community. Yeah, heard a bit about this already from you, Ross, personally, so I don't have too many questions myself, but out to the floor. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Ross. Just on that last point around the International Visitor Levy, which has been a bear bug for leaders in Queenstown for probably 20 years, I don't know, as long as that levy's been around. Is it just simply because politically the numbers don't stack up around the cabinet table or wherever the decision's made about where the funding goes from that levy? Is that the problem? By the sound of it, you're saying this project would tick all the boxes, Queenstown's unique, all the rest of it, but extracting that levy out of the government seems to, like you've alluded to, an impossible task. Is it just about the numbers politically?
I won't wade into the politics because it's not my area of expertise. I'm an engineer, so not a politician. But I will make a couple of comments that I have observed. So Benji, who's a pretty prominent economist in Queenstown, gave a presentation recently at a Westpac business event, And he mapped the performance of the New Zealand economy during the global financial crisis to the last few years. We're in a worse recession than we were through the GFC. So I have a lot of sympathy for the Treasury in particular trying to balance the numbers at the moment. And I think it's that simple. I think the economy is under huge pressure. There's massive demand or sort of, demands on a very limited revenue stream. And I guess it's likely that core agency funding is being supplemented by some of those funds. So they're not just simply not available to invest in projects like this that would, in the normal course of events, had the economy been in better condition, we might have had a better shot at being eligible for.
Cheers.
Kevin, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's a great place to visit if you've got time. So I'm just wondering if what you're doing is just simply moving a problem from one spot to the next spot. Right, so I fly over from Perth last week, pick up my rental car, and come over here, and wanted to have a look. This is actually happening at the moment, and wanted to have a look around Queenstown.
Yeah.
So how will you change that my mindset when I arrive from Perth to jump on this to go and have a look in Queenstown and then get a rental car to see the rest of New Zealand? And I might be underestimating the numbers of people that are doing that. And how are you going to get locals jumping onto this, say at the airport, as their way of getting into the town, and what infrastructure you'll have other than your station to accommodate their cars or whatever? So there's a couple of things in there.
Yeah. So there's a common question, right? Is how do you drive the 40% mode shift that the New Zealand Upgrade Program business case says we need to achieve by 2028 to not have network collapse, basically? That's your question.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, what's the counterfactual? What do you do instead? So if people continue to experience Queenstown in the way that you've said, so the status quo is basically that network demand, I gave you the numbers,
Yep.
6, 10 and 12% compound annual growth across those three parts of the network where we're measuring.
Yep.
If people don't choose to experience Queenstown in a different way, those trip times go exponential. So my understanding of places that have mass transit is that people start to experience those places in a different way. So people may still rent a rental car, but will the rental car depots be at the centre of town when there's mass rapid transit that's reliable and fast and cheap to get to the edge of town? Maybe not.
Yeah.
With the advent of rideshare, autonomous vehicles, I mean, I don't know if you've travelled recently, but big cities in the US and Europe and China, there's an absolute explosion in vehicle autonomy. And 16% of New Zealanders, and I wager probably more Queenstowners, own 3 or more vehicles per household. There's a house in my street that has 8 cars. 8. So that's obviously a flat with some workers renting. But the cost of car ownership and the convenience is so low relative to the alternatives that house hasn't managed to coordinate its daily movements. So I guess what we're trying to do as Southern Infrastructure is not recreate transport theory. What we're trying to do is respond to the 9 business cases that have said mode shift is necessary, land use change is happening. The council has planned and executed those land use changes. So Ladies Mile rezoning is complete. The developers are starting their process to develop the housing on Ladies Mile. Homestead Bay, 3,000 homes consented recently. So what we're trying to do is say we don't believe there's a plausible counterfactual, and we do believe that mass rapid transit, consistent with these business cases, is an essential part of a functional transport system. So we will deliver that part of the network, knowing that the other parts will evolve as well, including the regional council's bus network. It won't make sense to run as many buses delivering the same internodal capacity once the cable car's there. it will allow for a redeployment of that bus fleet to higher value distribution services as part of an integrated system. That requires an integrated ticketing product so that there's very seamless movement between modes. And we're finally seeing that with Motu Move, which is the New Zealand Transport Agency's $1 billion investment in ticketing, such that we can have fully integrated, seamless, sort of what they call frictionless transport and movement between modes. I believe that the Blue Highway around Queenstown is severely underutilised, and Franklin Road might be better serviced in the long term by a more regular ferry network, for example. So this is certainly not a case of the cable car solves all of our transport problems, but there is a very clear unmet demand, both currently and projected, that it does meet. And I guess, I'm encouraging exactly the types of conversations that you're raising to be had around how and where rental car fleet is used, how and where we encourage people to move on to ferry services, and what is it from a regional council point of view we can do to optimise the investment we're making in a bus fleet as well.
Thanks, Ross. We've got a bit of technical challenges, but I believe Gary and Kate have both got questions, and Alan as well. So maybe Kate first.
Okay. Look, this is really exciting and really interesting. Thank you. And I don't know that we've got time to ask every question, but just understanding at your hub or your nodes, what are you doing about parking, or is it the density of housing and you expect people to walk to those nodes? The second part of the question was about freight, and I presume it doesn't provide anything for freight, and thinking about a lot of traffic coming up from Invercargill and round. And the third question I had was the potential to go to Kelvin Heights, sorry. Is there any potential to go across the water, or does it have to be a ferry? Can gondolas provide an alternative from the southern routes, really?
Yeah, so freight car parking in Kelvin Heights. So
Yep.
on the freight question, I ran ski fields for 7 years, and we used our gondolas extensively for moving freight around the ski fields. They're amazing for moving wheelie bins. We've evacuated patients. So they are extremely high capacity. And one of the freight tasks that we see the cable car being used for immediately is baggage. We are in discussions with Air New Zealand about having a baggage check-in at Queenstown CBD at the cable car station. Once you can liberate people from their bags in a tourism sense, they can move around a lot more freely, and walking distances expand considerably. If people are attached to their bags, it's very difficult to get them to walk to hotels or that final destination, or to use active modes of travel, sort of scooters, bikes, etc. So yes, absolutely. But the primary freight task we see the cable car delivering is the baggage freight task, moving. The dominant movement is between the CBD and the airport. We see that in the data. You don't need to believe me on that one. And that is a task that we're looking at and working with, like I said, in New Zealand, but we're also preparing a bit of a model that we'll be taking to key hotel partners as well as part of that. So that's that one. On the parking, there's a particular parking task that we are looking at, which is QLDC in about 2018-19 did a lot of work on developing a car park building on the Boundary Street car park in the town centre. That's the station location, but the cable car station takes up very little land. They're quite compact in their design, and they're elevated, so they don't occupy space at ground level. So we are looking at, we have requested and QLDC has approved the release of all the drawings to us, and we are looking at whether or not we would roll the development of that car park building into this project. So that's something we're looking at specifically. We aren't trying to do all of it though. So there are a whole lot of entrepreneurial landowners who will develop their own parking solutions around mass transit, like happens in every other city on the planet. And so we're certainly not trying to do all of that. We know that all sorts of interesting park and ride shuttles will evolve. NZ Ski and Real Journeys, who operate significant bus fleets through the winter time, will no doubt evolve how they use their bus services to integrate into the network. One of the huge challenges they face, NZ Ski is a bigger bus operator in Queenstown than you are as the regional council. And one of their biggest challenges is their bus fleet's getting stuck in traffic on Frankton Road. So the utilisation rate for them is declining rapidly in the same way it does for the council. So what I can say is that the private sector is very innovative and they react very quickly once they know infrastructure is coming. So we're quite hopeful of that. And then the final question was Kelvin Grove. There's a very easy to build solution, but there's a much harder consenting problem to connect a cable car to Kelvin Heights. So, I mean, this is where we've got to start having some more adult conversations about the type of place we want Queenstown to be. If we want it to be highly accessible and highly mobile, well connected, there are low cost, very efficient ways to do that, particularly in the case of Kelvin Heights, but they require a consenting solution and they require some trade-offs. And that's probably a bridge too far for me. I have enough grey hair and my wife tells me I'm thinning on top. So we'd love to see some support for those types of consenting pathways or transport corridors.
That's great, and thank you very much. And someone can mute me after this because I can't. But I would love to see that as a dotted line, because it just seems to take out a lot of the other traffic that would otherwise be going past the airport, past Frankton, potentially, and from Jack's point and all the substantial development heading south.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree.
Thanks, Kate. Gary.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Ross. Great progress that you're making, and well done for where you are so far and where you can get to. My question is around basically everything you've shown us is routes that are pretty much replacing state highways. And so we really have to draw the conclusion that state highways haven't advanced to match the development and have been allowed to be almost minimalist while the development has trucked its way on. And so the government and NZTA have basically gotten off scot-free. And I've always been a strong contender of, I think, the bare minimum of the state highways and the likes of the Frankton Bridge. They needed a greater level of development and advancement. So I guess my question is, you've alluded to targeted rates to us. Where does the government, and within the funding model, where do you see the government sitting around it? Are we talking reasonable proportions could be attributed to where the government should be in this, or is it more likely to be back towards targeted rates?
So I won't go into the specifics because that might be a bit of sort of in the kind of silence conversation around our view of where that might end up. We're in those kind of discussions at the moment, so we wouldn't probably be just ready to fully publicly talk about that. But what I can say is, on a first principles basis, one of the single largest beneficiaries of the Ladies Mile line is the New Zealand Transport Agency. It offsets several $100 million of direct investment that they would otherwise need to make in transport infrastructure and upgrades. And we think, just on a straight out value for money basis, this infrastructure, the costing work we've done is around about $30 million a kilometre to build. That includes the vehicles, I might add. So this is not sort of a roading based investment where you build the road and you still have to find the fleet and the drivers and all the rest of it. Once you build it, that's it. That is extremely good value for money on a counterfactual basis compared with what we're seeing in land-based transport at the moment. And so we think there is a compelling case for the Transport Agency to make a contribution either through operating contributions or a capital contribution or both. But that's obviously a live conversation, and it's one that, again, just like the Treasury, the Transport Agency's funding is under huge pressure right now.
Yeah, cool. But I suppose my concern is that, is there a risk that this, just like cycling and walking and other modes have been promoted in the past, that without continuing the investment in roads as well, that NZTA and the government keep getting off scot-free and being able to say we won't do anything more than what we currently have because there's these other options? And I guess my fear is that we should be promoting both. Yours definitely has to go.
No, I totally agree. Yeah, sorry, I should be very clear about that. This is not a case of and or. This is a case of here's some relief to allow you to get on with the roading upgrades that otherwise would be extremely disruptive to the Queenstown public. So I absolutely agree, and I think it is very much a case of and, not or.
Cool. Okay, great. Thank you.
Alan?
Thanks. Clearly, and you've made the point that this whole scheme is dependent on getting people successfully to the nodes, and you've already talked a bit about how the public bus network has a role in that. So just to clarify on the airport to Queenstown Central route, we've got the two ends there. Are there any stops in the middle as well?
There are corners in the network from Queenstown Airport to the town centre. So there's a stop at the bus hub, which is the primary interchange to do the distribution function I talked about. Once we have a network out to the southern corridor in future stages, that will completely change again how that bus hub location is used. And my suspicion is it might be more utilised at that point for the Milford Sound type traveller or the remarkable ski field type traveller to interchange between a private bus operation and public transport. But certainly in the initial phase, that bus hub is a really important link between the bus feeder networks or distribution services and that core MRT network.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And look, any just small comment about how you see getting people to those nodes, both pedestrians and cyclists and people using public transport, as well as those other drivers, people in cars, how that can successfully work? You're sort of planning around those things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things. So in addition to generously financing this risky part of this project, people like Rod Drew have invested a ton of money and donated a ton of money to building cycleways around Queenstown, and that continues. My kids bike to school. It's a thing that Queenstown kids grow up doing, and I think as we're starting to see pressure on even bus services for the likes of our school children, active travel is something that we think is essential and complementary. So great to see that the NPS for UD, or the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, defines walkable catchments for New Zealand public transport. And what it says is that New Zealanders don't probably walk a lot, and could walk a fair bit more when we look at our sort of peer cities around the world where they have good public transport systems. But in order to convince people to walk to a public transport node, it has to be reliable, it has to be frequent, it has to be low cost. And we haven't traditionally been able to meet that trifecta. So the cable car provides people the opportunity to leave whenever they like and know precisely what the trip time is between one node and the next. That is the game changer. That's combined with having it low cost. That's the thing that means there's a cabin every 12 seconds. I don't need to know what the timetable is. I can literally have my coffee, tie my shoes and get there. And the second thing is obviously that the trip time is known because it's not competing with any other transport. So 20 minutes from the airport to the city is 20 minutes every day of the week, not 25 or 40, depending on the time of day. That's the critical difference that helps grow that catchment. The sort of final point on this is you can put 2 bikes on a bus, subject to current constraints, but normally you can put 2 bikes on the front of a bus. You put 2 or 3 bikes in every single cabin. There's a cabin every 12 seconds. So as a mode that enables really efficient connectivity to active transport, cable car is quite unique, not just for bikes, obviously for scooters and e-scooters and all sorts of different transport options. The connectivity and the fact that you've just got this voluminous space is particularly helpful.
Okay, thanks.
Final point, sorry, is that the single biggest lever you can pull on that is urban planning, and that lever is being pulled. So that's the density piece. Yeah.
Thanks, Ross. You talked about a couple of other places globally where gondolas have been installed and are working well. What's the uptake between reality and the modelling in terms of the visitor usage and the local usage? How's that tracking there? Because obviously, you know, as Kevin pointed out, educating visitors can be more simple or more complicated, and getting habit changes from locals can also be more simple or more complicated. So what are the numbers showing? What's the forecasting versus reality?
So I don't know that, and I don't know if the regional council do you keep data on the mix of visitors and residents that catch the bus currently?
No.
Cool. So if you had data, I could use it to give you an answer to that, which would be to interpolate the maximum demands we expect and to disaggregate them. But it is quite difficult because a lot of places don't differentiate between a visitor and a resident. What I can say though is if you think about the customer journey and you're climbing out of an airplane, you need legibility, you need proximity, you need frequency, has to be affordable relative to the counterfactual, and you need a convenient solution. So that's why we're thinking about things like that luggage service. When you climb off an airplane in Japan to go skiing at Hakuba, you can pay $20-30 equivalent and your bags will turn up, your skis at your hotel. That's the kind of visitor experience that means that people are very happy to catch a train when they go skiing in Japan, and they don't need to think about a rental car, which quite often, if you go skiing in Europe, you do think about because you don't have that same luggage interface. So that's the little bit of work, that's the innovation, I guess, that we're thinking about. The proximity of the station to the airport is essential, and we are working quite closely with the airport and their current redesign of their terminal. They've recently appointed their architects for the project, and we'll be sitting down to engage with them at the right time on the legibility and the connectivity between the new terminal and the station. So those are all things that are in our mind to ensure that you really maximise or reduce the friction or the barriers for those different user groups as much as you can. I'll just say as well, it actually doesn't matter that we don't consider State Highway 6A to be a visitor highway, even though, I don't know, maybe 2/3 of the people that travel down that road are visitors. It's just a road. And likewise, it's a somewhat unhelpful distinction to disaggregate the patronage on the cable car. What we do know is that for every person that does do that, there's one less Uber, or there's one less taxi, or there's one less rental car. And the essential thing is that the people who have tools, or they've got complicated family itineraries because they've got to take children to the doctor or whatever, who need to drive, they need relief. So what we need to do is, regardless of who it is, what is the trip that comes off that road, it helps unlock capacity for the people who can't move off the road. And that's the really essential thing that we're trying to achieve.
I guess one of the reasons for that question is that when we're looking at ongoing funding, when we're asking our ratepayers to do it, is people looking at what's in it for me, and will I be using it, and what's the cost if I've got a targeted rate on my property as well as paying for a usage.
Yeah.
But the visitors are using it, so that's and I guess it comes down to the pricing model.
Which is,
that's what I was curious, in Paris where you said it's been successful,
Yeah.
how many is that? Are the school kids going to school, or mum and dad going to the supermarket, or going to work or whatever, versus someone who's there for a day to go and get a photo at the top of the mountain or whatever it is?
There's two comments on that. One is, firstly, we would love to see this council work with us on the pricing design to develop a model that equitably prices the difference between what residents already pay in fixed costs through targeted rates and what visitors pay because they only pay the variable component or the ticket price. So there should be some redress there, and we think there's some clever ways to achieve that through pricing design. That's point one, to get pricing equity. Point two is the reason why we say beneficiaries pays or exacerbator pays, not user pays, is because if I take the cable car, you benefit when you drive because you get a more reliable trip time. Yeah. So it's a communication exercise to help road users understand that anyone who takes it is benefiting them as well. That's, a car takes up 18 square meters of pavement. Every one less of those that chooses to use the cable car is generating benefits for the residual people who choose to use the road. So that is why it's called the beneficiaries pays principle, not the user pays principle. And the funding model that we've developed is deliberately designed to address that and ensure that there's an equitable funding mix, if you like, between visitors and residents. And I want to add by saying, when we do the maths, we don't believe there's a need to have a huge step change in targeted rates at all. This looks very compelling, provided we get the pricing design right, which is why I made the first point about pricing design. It looks like Queenstown residents, for once, will have the opportunity to lean on the visitor economy a bit more than they have in the past, provided we get that pricing design right.
Any other questions around the table here? Online? Yeah.
It's just my interest. You talked about the roadway providers being determined. Does that include the gondolas, or are they separate? And you talk about buildings, the building infrastructure being separate. Roadway, are the gondola carriages, are they part of the roadway?
The cabins are part of the roadway. Yeah, they're part of the one package.
Yeah, I sort of thought maybe someone likely built them or something like that.
No, they're built in France and Switzerland. That's basically it. Yeah, globally.
So just the state of play. So on your timeline, you have, you lodged a resource consent application with QLDC?
No, through the Fast Track Act. So we're patiently waiting for a decision on referral of that application, which we believe is imminent. Assuming that project is referred into the fast track process, then by the end of this calendar year, we should have a decision.
Very good. Okay. Anything else? Everybody happy with the information that's come through? Thank you. Anything else you want to add in your conclusion then, Ross?
If you have a couple more minutes, we could talk a little bit more about the commercials. Otherwise, happy to finish it there.
Yeah, so maybe we do just drop into non-public. That might allow a more fulsome answer to Gary's previous question, and then anything else that Ross might have in his mind he could share that would otherwise be commercial in confidence. So we do have the justification to push this into non-public. Just to close out the public part, so ORC's role in this is obviously through Anita and the transport team. There's a lot of work being done at the moment to answer the questions raised predominantly through the regional deal process, but questions we have known, many of which Ross covered, around pressures on the network and what an optimum transport solution might look like using all of the different modes. There is no one solution for this. There's some work being done that will come back. Obviously, the business case for public transport flagged a significant increase in investment for buses in future years, and that was included in the long-term plan. It also, within that, flagged the need for a mass rapid transport system. It didn't define what that would be, but it was very clear in stating it would be needed. And I guess the relevant part of or comment Ross made in that update then is that was based on population growth statistics that have been consistently blown out of the water. So the statement in the business case that it will be needed in future, I think what the transport and that's QRDC, NZTA and ourselves are looking at now is, well, have we arrived at the point in time where that statement was referring to? So there's some work going on in the network at the moment, broader. I guess if you call it NZTA strategic network, and you'll have the chance to hear from James Cagle straight after this, actually. So it might be a question for him in terms of where that's at. There's some work that our team are doing around what does the future of a public transport network look like, and that's not just this, that's looking at those other questions we've had around this table before about Cromwell, about Wanaka, and broader regional connections. And then there's specifically the questions that Ross has got around to enable the model to develop, how might it interact or intersect with our public transport network. And we're looking at how we engage, appreciating that this is moving quicker than we probably would otherwise, but we know that there are some key questions, and we've just got to make sure we've got the staff and the time to engage properly and also have the right conversations around this table as well. So plenty more to come in this space, and I think as we start our conversations around the long-term plan process, we have a big conversation to have around Queenstown Lakes transport generally, because we know we've got Ministry of Education bus issues over there. We know we've got PT challenges, and there are just those broader transport challenges. So that's sort of where we're at from an ORC perspective.
Right, thank you. We'll conclude the public session and therefore the recording of this and move into a non-public session, because The public can be excluded from the following items under the LGOIMA section 7 to B due to the commercial incompetence nature of the conversation.
Yes.